You'd think being a bride meant being the star of the show, but in Victorian England, it often meant you were just the most elaborately dressed prop. I'm your bedtime historian, and tonight we'll slip on someone else's wedding shoes, tight inherited and likely chosen by a cousin you barely liked. The silk was stiff, the corset tighter, and the plans. Well, they weren't really yours. Victorians loved a wedding, but not necessarily for the bride's happiness. These were social performances, not personal milestones. Why else would engagement announcements read more like livestock transactions? If sleep is the goal and passive horror is your lullaby, go ahead and give that, like button a sleepy tap. Subscribing won't get you married off by candlelight, but it might bring a few more strange rituals to your nightstand. I always wonder, if you had to wear one historical outfit to bed, which era would you pick? Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake up in a corset, not just any corset, but one lace tighter than your patience. You're not in your own room. You're not even in your own dress. The veil is antique, and it smells faintly of mothballs and someone else's regrets. It's your wedding day. Or so you're told. Victorian weddings were rarely built on personal dreams. They were crafted by committee mothers, aunts, matchmakers, and etiquette manuals the size of bricks. The bride was just another component, an important one, sure, but certainly not the decision-maker. In many cases, even the groom had less input than the meddling mother-in-law, who insisted on adding a fourth course of aspic. The announcement of your engagement would have arrived not with joy, but with paperwork. Printed in local papers or stiff formal cards, it listed names, income, lineage like a financial merger more than a love story. Miss Louisa Ann Worthington, only daughter of the late Colonel Worthington of Kent, is to be wed to Mr. Frederick Blythe of the Blythes of Lancashire, and so on. The tone was not celebratory, it was evaluative. Some families even published announcements before the bride knew she was engaged. A few fainted. Others simply nodded and asked if they would be allowed to keep the dog. Love. That was optional. Many Victorian couples met just a handful of times before marriage. At best, they were encouraged to find mutual respect. At worst, mutual indifference was fine, as long as no scandals arose. Historians continue to debate whether these unions were stoic traditions or quiet tragedies. It's hard to say, really, when so many personal letters were burned or redacted to preserve the family name. One odd detail. Some Victorian wedding guides warned against the bride smiling too much during the ceremony. It might suggest eagerness, or worse, desire. Better to maintain a soft, noble sorrow, like someone being gently kidnapped by lace. And so, here you are, dressed corseted and corseted again. The dress isn't yours. The vows aren't yours. The moment isn't quite yours either. But the silence is. And in that silence, you begin the day. The invitation looked innocent enough, just a folded piece of paper, delicately scented, tied with a ribbon so tight you'd think it was holding back a secret. But for Victorians, receiving a wedding invitation could be as stressful as planning the event itself. Not because the event was especially joyful, but because the paper, the ink, and even the seal all screamed behave exactly right, or risk exile from the cucumber sandwich crowd. Invitations were handwritten in copperplate calligraphy, so elaborate it often required interpretation. Enter the footman, a walking envelope, who delivered these missives with the solemnity of a tax collector. Guests weren't merely invited, they were summoned. The paper alone could weigh as much as a small Bible, and smelled like lavender ink and the quiet threat of scandal. If you were lucky, you received it with only mild panic. If you were unlucky, it arrived just after a minor injury. Paper cuts were common, and more than one wrist was sprained, trying to decipher the loops of Mrs. Featherstone Fitzherbert's signature. Etiquette books advised how to receive such a thing. Did you open it yourself? Did you wait for a family member to break the seal? Some guides claimed a young lady must not touch it until instructed by her chaperone. Others insisted it be opened immediately to show enthusiasm. Historians remain divided on just how widespread this etiquette panic truly was, but surviving letters suggest that, yes, people really did stress this much about invitations. And the wording. Oh, the wording. No contractions, no exclamation marks. Every line had to follow a rigid formula. A typical example, Mr. and Mrs. Henry Bramble request the honor of your presence at the marriage of their daughter, Miss Eleanor Ann Bramble, to Mr. Charles Ambrose, Witherby at St. Margaret's on the 24th of March at 3 o'clock precisely. Each noun and honorific was a minefield. Miss, Mrs., Mistress each had legal and social implications. Get it wrong, and you might be disinvited from every future event. One woman was blacklisted from her social circle for sending an invite that referred to a widow as Mrs. instead of Madam. She blamed the stationer blamed the maid. The maid was never heard from again. For brides, sending these invitations meant days of handwriting even if one had staff. Most did it while seated stiffly at a parlor table, wearing gloves to prevent ink stains. It wasn't uncommon to develop small finger cramps, or ink finger, a mildly alarming condition in which the skin remained stained for days. Several etiquette authors wrote long chapters on how to avoid appearing blotched. Some brides added sprigs of herbs or pressed petals into the envelope. This was not for romance, but to impress guests with one's aesthetic sensibility. Others included wax seals so ornate they occasionally jammed the postman's bags. Postage costs soared. One bride in 1874 reportedly spent more on invitations than on her own wedding meal. So you stand there, invitation in hand, fingers aching from anticipation. Not of the wedding, but of whether you'll be able to read the thing without needing smelling salts. The dress was white. Pure, blinding, ceremonial white. But the fittings were red, silent little rituals of pinpricks, corset bruises, and the kind of shallow breathing that made ladies faint in perfect posture. You don't sit during a Victorian dress fitting. You stand for hours, while your body is pulled, pinched, and sculpted into a silhouette that whispers chastity but screams internal bleeding. Every tug on the corset strings was accompanied by a calm, just a bit tighter dear. It always meant 10 more inches, and one less lung. The fabric itself was rarely local. Silk from France, lace from Belgium, satin from somewhere that involved tariffs and a shipping delay. But the nerves, entirely homegrown. A bride's gown was often the most expensive garment she'd ever wear, and the most painful. Some fittings required 3 women, one to adjust the bodice, one to tighten the corset, and one to catch the bride if she fainted. Many did, some quietly, others with dramatic flair and a slight hope that it would delay the wedding by a week. It never did. It wasn't just about beauty, it was about engineering. Boning made from whale baleen or steel shaped the torso. Layers upon layers, undergarments, petticoats, hoops, skirts, bodice. Each had to lie flat while also creating volume. And then came the outer gown, with trains that trailed across drawing room floors like surrendered flags. Moving gracefully in one of these ensembles required training. Some young brides practiced walking for weeks. One even tied books to her knees to perfect the right glide. A single loose stitch could spark panic. One thread out of place, and Aunt Margaret would have something to discuss for years. Seamstresses worked with brutal precision, often overnight and without breaks. A badly cut hemline once led to a lawsuit, filed not by the bride, but by the groom's mother. Historians still debate whether she was truly scandalized or simply bored. And then there were the secret stabbings. Tiny jabs from stray pins left in during final checks. Brides bled, quietly. One diary entry from 1862 reads 2 pinpricks, one near collarbone, one at rib. Ignored both, smiled. Am perfect. That bride's name is lost, but her attitude eternal. Even the shoes weren't safe. Delicate ivory satin with paper-thin soles, designed less for walking and more for perching. Some brides had shoes made a size too small on purpose to encourage a dainty limp. A charming detail. Until you realize the reception line stretched 2 hours, and the veil, heavy, suffocating, often infused with starch so strong it left a dusty trail in the air. One bride reportedly sneezed so hard, her entire headdress shifted sideways. The photograph captured it forever. Some scholars argue that this suffering was embraced as a rite of passage proof of fortitude, elegance, and commitment. Others claim it was simply overlooked in the excitement of spectacle. There is no scholarly consensus on whether Victorian fashion empowered brides or immobilized them in tulle and steel. But here you are, dressed, compressed, smiling faintly because someone said it looks better that way, and praying no one notices the blood on your gloves. The bridesmaids were lined up like ornamental soldiers, each one a carefully selected balance of social status, complexion, and floral coordination. You weren't chosen because you were the bride's dearest friend. You were chosen because your cheekbones wouldn't outshine hers. Or maybe just barely would. That was the trick. Victorian bridesmaids lived on a knife's edge of beauty diplomacy. Too pretty and whispers would circulate. Was the groom really in love with the bride? Too plain, and the entire party looked poorly assembled. One bridesmaid's freckles were once powdered over because they distracted from the whiteness theme. Another was asked to wear gloves not for modesty but to hide a tan. Summer in Brighton had betrayed her. The number of bridesmaids wasn't arbitrary either. It signaled class wealth and connections. 4 meant respectable. 6 or 8, very fashionable. Anything more, your mother was clearly showing off. Some families even borrow cousins just to round out the look. A few borrowed actresses. There are rumors of a Viscount's daughter hiring a whole row of matching brunettes just to offset her fiery hair. Being a bridesmaid wasn't an honor, it was unpaid labor. Duties ranged from adjusting the bride's skirt to fluffing flowers to enduring hours of awkward small talk with second cousins. And don't forget the rehearsed procession walk, slowly hands low face angelic. If you tripped, it was blamed on you. If you cried, it was emotionally disruptive. If you smiled too much. Well, what were you trying to suggest? The dresses were often identical, but rarely comfortable. Many were second-hand. Some were hand-sewn by the bride's aunt or family seamstress, which meant uneven hemlines and panic stitching the morning of. Others came from department stores and didn't quite match the shade described in the invitation. A single misaligned color, say mauve instead of lavender, could haunt a woman's social standing for a decade. And then there was the bouquet game. Some bridesmaids carried exact replicas of the bride's arrangement. Others were given scaled-down versions or entirely different species of flower to create a tiered hierarchy of importance. One woman's diary lamented being handed the carnations, which were apparently a symbol of third-tier favor, not to mention the emotional politics. If you weren't asked to be a bridesmaid, it meant something. If you were asked and then replaced, it meant everything. And woe to the bridesmaid who looked better in sepia photography than the bride herself. There were reported instances of sudden positioning changes. Susan, perhaps you could stand more in the back. Historians remain divided on whether Victorian bridesmaids were truly honored or merely decorative decoys. Some argue their role gave them visibility and courtship potential. Others point to the social friction, the rigid rules, and the sheer number of stained gloves and awkward group portraits. Still here, you are watching the bride blink slowly beneath 12 feet of veil, while you angle your shoulders and hold your bouquet just right. You're not supposed to speak, just shimmer, just enough, but never more. The flowers were perfect until they weren't. Arranged with mathematical precision and soaked in layers of meaning, the Victorian wedding bouquet wasn't just decoration. It was a coded language, a test of botany, and, more often than not, a respiratory threat. You hold it now. Itchy, dense, suspiciously damp. Orange blossoms representing chastity poke out at sharp angles. Lavender means devotion. Ivy clinging and symbolic trails like vines across your gloves. There's rosemary for remembrance, which feels ominous, and a sprig of myrtle because someone's grandmother insisted. The bouquet is so tightly bundled it might be weaponized. Several guests already sneezed during the vows. Victorian floral symbolism was a full-blown obsession. Entire books were published on the language of flowers, each bloom assigned a trait message or moral. Brides didn't just pick their favorites, they orchestrated arrangements like telegrams. One unfortunate bride reportedly combined yellow roses and red carnations, envy and disdain, which sent her aunt into a minor existential crisis. Yet, despite all this meaning, many brides had no idea what they were carrying. The florist did, or their mother did. Sometimes the groom's family sent the flowers without consultation. This led to infamous moments where bouquets had to be reassembled last minute to avoid accidental insult. One bouquet meant to signal eternal love, accidentally spelled domestic sorrow in peony lily lavender sequence. The arrangements were tightly bound with lace ribbon and sometimes wire. This kept them stiff so stiff that the bouquet never looked wilted, but also didn't breathe. You certainly didn't. Some women held them with gloved hands, others had loops to dangle them from the wrist. A few designs were so large they resembled small hedges. A famous duchess reportedly rested hers on a piano between photos to avoid arm fatigue. And the scent. Oh, the scent. The flowers were chosen not only for appearance, but for fragrance. This was less charming when mixed with perfume starch and the sweat of 200 guests in a drawing room. Some brides complained of headaches. Others developed sneezing fits so intense they disrupted the hymn singing. There is one account of a bride collapsing in front of the vicar during the Lord's Prayer, blamed on volatile floral vapors. Not that the sniffles stopped the ceremony. You kept going, red-eyed, drippy-nosed, but determined. Historians still argue whether these moments were downplayed or quietly acknowledged as the true cost of aesthetic purity. Some diaries hint at a resigned humor. I sneezed through the kiss. Mother said it made me look bashful. Interestingly, flowers were often reused. After the ceremony, bouquets might be dried and displayed, pressed into albums, or dismantled into keepsakes. In some cases, guests would pocket a blossom for luck. One superstition warned that touching a bride's bouquet uninvited might transfer her bad luck, especially if her gloves were damp. So, here you are, bouquet in hand, smile fixed in place, while a rogue petal brushes against your lip. You're trying to look serene, not itchy. Poised, not puffy. But your eyes betray you. And the ivy, it's starting to cling. The cake was being sliced. The room smelled of sugar sherry and suppressed disappointment. Somewhere between the toast and the third verse of God Save the Queen, someone realized the groom was gone. Not in the next room, not outside for a breath of air. Gone, like a handkerchief in the wind. And this wasn't an isolated case. Victorian weddings, for all their pomp and orchestration, occasionally featured one startling element, the disappearing groom. You're standing in lace wondering if this is part of the program. Maybe he's fetching a gift or powdering his nose, but minutes pass. Guests murmur. A bridesmaid drops a fork. You begin to realize that he's not late. He's fled. Victorian engagement customs were rigid. For men, accepting a proposal, or rather agreeing to one proposed by families, was considered a contract. Engagements were announced in the paper, gifts exchanged, expectations set. But marriage, that was permanence. No easy exits, no easy nights. and no room for regret once the license was signed. Some grooms buckled under pressure. There are recorded cases of men escaping through windows feigning illness, or simply walking out between courses. One groom in 1871 left a note on a pudding. "Tell them I'm very sorry, but not that sorry." Newspapers occasionally reported these incidents in euphemism. The ceremony was postponed due to unforeseen travel, or Mr. Wilkins took ill just before the service and is recovering in the countryside. But local gossip always filled in the blanks. A man who vanished at the altar became legend part villain, part folk hero. His bride, often pitied, sometimes blamed, and forever known as the one who almost married. There is little agreement among historians as to how common this truly was. Some say it was rare but dramatized. Others believe cold feet were more widespread than records show, hidden beneath layers of propriety and carefully managed correspondence. One notable case involved a groom who walked out just as the organist began. He left behind his gloves, his vows, and half a meat pie. The bride reportedly turned to her mother and said, "Well, at least the flowers are fresh, but why run?" Some speculate fear of marital expectations, financial, sexual, domestic. Others point to the pressure of marrying for duty rather than affection. A few simply panicked. They had been led through fittings, dinners, inspections, and only realized at the final moment that they had no idea who they were marrying. And here's the twist. Some of those vanished grooms came back. Days later, weeks. One even returned after a year, claiming a sudden desire to see the Alps. The bride was not amused. Her new husband was. So here you are, still in your gown, the guests still waiting, and the cake getting stale. You stare at the door, willing it to open. Maybe he'll return, maybe he won't. But the flowers are still fragrant and the bouquet still itchy. And someone just asked if the pianist knows another hymn. The church was warm, too warm. Someone had opened a window, but it only let in the smell of horses and heat. The vicar dabbed his brow with a handkerchief already soaked. He turned to the groom, then to the bride, and forgot her name. It wasn't unusual. Victorian clergymen, particularly in busy parishes, could perform up to 8 weddings in a single day. Memory blurred, faces merged, and names, those delicate markers of identity, became interchangeable under the weight of repetition and sweat. You stand there, veil fluttering, slightly listening, as the officiant mutters, "Do you miss, Eleanor? That's not your name." Your aunt gasps. Your father stiffens. You smile politely and correct him. He nods flustered. Of course. Miss Beatrice." Some scholars argue that this frequency of mistakes reveals just how institutionalized the ceremony had become. It wasn't a sacred bond so much as a public performance with a tired director. Others suggest it points to the emotional detachment of officiants who were more administrators than spiritual guides. Records from the period confirm a range of mishaps. Rings were mixed up, vows were skipped. One vicar accidentally used the funeral rite for the opening prayer. A guest coughed loudly, but no one corrected him. Another once fainted mid-service, crumpling to the floor like a damp sermon. The couple was later married at home. The pressure to keep things moving didn't help. Churches were booked back to back, with little time to adjust or recover. Brides sometimes arrived late, only to be hurried down the aisle with whispered urgings of, "Quickly now, we've another party at 2. The ceremony, once considered solemn, began to feel transactional. Mistakes were not taken lightly. Families sent letters of complaint. In some cases, entire services were redone in private to cleanse the embarrassment. A minor mispronunciation could turn into a minor scandal. One bishop allegedly called a bride Miss Butterbottom instead of Batterum. He wasn't invited to the reception. Still, clergymen soldiered on. They dealt with fainting brides, drunken uncles, and the occasional toddler wandering up the aisle mid-vow. Their cassocks clung to them in the heat. Their fingers fumbled over prayer books. Some had assistants whispering names from the sidelines like cue cards at a theater. You try to stay calm. Your name has been restored. The crowd has settled. The vicar is now sweating onto the lectern, muttering his lines like a man racing through a bedtime story. The words no longer feel sacred, just rehearsed. And yet in this moment, you are aware acutely that everyone is watching, waiting, hoping it will go off without further hiccup. You grip your bouquet, still itchy. The groom squeezes your hand. It's damp. Unavoidable, really. The vicar clears his throat, finally landing the phrase, "by the power vested in me." Historians continue to debate whether such moments were charmingly human or disturbingly routine. Either way, you're now married, or at least someone named Beatrice is. You're not on a stage, but it feels like one. The drawing room is packed, every chair filled, every window slightly cracked to let in whispers from the garden. This isn't a wedding, it's a performance, and you, dear bride, are the headline act. Victorian weddings often unfolded not in grand cathedrals, but in homes dressed up to impersonate chapels. Parlors were rearranged, pianists, imported carpets rolled back. If space allowed, an archway of flowers was constructed sometimes so top-heavy it required hidden ropes or discreet cousins to hold it upright. And always there were spectators. These weren't just family and friends. They were neighbors, acquaintances, the socially curious. If the bride came from money, or even moderate fame, the guest list ballooned. In one noted case, so many people arrived that the bride's brother stood guard at the footpath with a walking stick, gently redirecting the uninvited toward a nearby orchard. And then there were the uninvited watchers. Victorian gardens weren't entirely private. Curious children pressed their faces to glass. Aunts from rival families lingered behind hedges, pretending to admire the roses. One wedding was famously disrupted when a goat escaped from a neighboring pasture and wandered into the aisle unbothered by ceremony or social class. You try to focus. You repeat the vows. But the silence between each line isn't filled with reverence. It's full of scrutiny. Did she say obey too eagerly? Did he pause too long before I do? Every twitch, blink, and tremble is noted by at least 3 whispering mouths. In wealthier circles, some families hired artists to sketch the event in real time. The sketches were often romanticized, rosy cheeks, ideal posture, no visible sweat. But guests remember differently. One diary recalled bride appeared flushed. Groom recited vows with what I felt was excessive confidence, possibly rehearsed too much. The pressure to perform extended beyond the couple. Bridesmaids had to smile on cue. Mothers dabbed their eyes at pre-approved moments. Children were bribed with sweets to stand still. And yet, despite all this choreography, something always went slightly wrong. A dog barked, a vase tipped, someone sneezed mid-blessing. Historians disagree whether this scrutiny enhanced the sense of ritual or diluted its sincerity. Some claim the public nature affirmed the community's role in marriage. Others argue it turned the sacred into spectacle, a theater of etiquette and lace. You glance toward the door. Someone's arriving late. Everyone turns to look. The vicar pauses. The pianist fumbles. And for a moment, you exist not as a person, but as a tableau still posed and vaguely itchy from both your gloves and the attention. But then the moment passes. A breeze filters through the open window. The vows conclude. And the room lets out the softest sigh like an audience unsure whether to clap. No curtain falls. Just a quiet shuffle toward the next ritual. It looked innocent. A sweet, modest tower of white. But beneath the thick icing and sugar flowers lurked a danger not even the bride's nerves could rival the traditional Victorian wedding cake. You're handed a slice. It's dense. Alarmingly so. as if it were forged rather than baked. The knife hesitated. The server used 2 hands, and still a chunk landed with a weighty thud on your plate. Welcome to the world of fruitcake warfare. Victorian wedding cakes were not soft affairs. Built from dark, rich fruitcake soaked in brandy or sherry, they were designed for preservation, both symbolic and literal. A good slice could survive decades. Some were saved to mark anniversaries or christenings. Others ended up in attics wrapped in cloth, where they hardened into something just shy of fossil. The icing, not buttercream, not fondant. Royal icing made with egg whites and powdered sugar, set like plaster. Guests had to chisel through it. Some used forks. The bold used knives. One uncle reportedly broke a dessert spoon. Another cracked a molar. The bride's mother claimed he was dramatic. The dentist disagreed. And then came the choking hazards. Victorian tradition demanded that small objects be baked into the cake for luck. A coin, a ring, a thimble, a wishbone. Each had a meaning. Find the coin, expect wealth. Find the ring, expect a wedding of your own. Find the thimble, spinsterhood, allegedly. Guests chewed carefully, then less carefully, as wine circulated. At one wedding, a cousin bit into the sixpence and swallowed it whole. She later called it a blessing. She also refused x-rays for years. To guard against disaster, some families distributed small cards listing the items hidden inside, like a scavenger hunt meets dental emergency. Still, accidents occurred. One guest reportedly tucked his uneaten cake into his coat pocket for luck. The brandy soaked through. He was later mistaken for a drunkard on the train home. The cakes themselves were marvels of ambition. Some stood 3 tiers high, decorated with sugar columns, lace patterns, and sometimes figurines of dove's cherubs or miniature versions of the couple. In one famously overdone affair, a model of the bride's family home was recreated entirely in icing down to the chimney pots. It collapsed during the toast. Serving the cake was a ceremony in itself. The bride made the first cut with the groom's hand over hers, a tradition signifying unity, or possibly a silent warning. After that, a line formed. Plates were passed. Some guests kept theirs untouched, a souvenir. Others gobbled theirs as if the brandy might ease the pain of long speeches. Historians continue to debate whether Victorian cakes were genuinely enjoyed or merely endured. Some accounts speak of rich flavor and familial joy. Others mention bloating cracked teeth and a deeply unsettling texture. You eye your slice. There's something shiny inside. You hesitate. Could be a coin, could be part of a spoon. Either way, you smile faintly, raise your fork, and chew carefully, like you're mining for secrets in a dessert that might outlive you. Smile, don't blink, and whatever you do, don't move. Welcome to the world of Victorian wedding photography, where looking in love meant looking perfectly still for 30 full minutes. You're perched on a stiff-backed chair veil, arranged just so, hands delicately placed on your lap. The photographer, a solemn man with inky fingers and a dramatic mustache, adjusts a curtain behind you. Hold very still, he mutters, as though you'd been twitching like a squirrel. You haven't moved in 7 minutes. Early photographic techniques weren't built for spontaneity. Exposure times ranged from 15 to 45 seconds, but the entire setup from posing to printing could stretch to hours. Smiles were discouraged, movement was forbidden, and blinking a one-way ticket to becoming a ghostly blur in your own wedding portrait. Brides fainted, grooms fell asleep. One bride reportedly passed out mid-shot, only to be held upright by 2 unseen assistants crouching behind her skirt. The photo, when printed, was declared hauntingly serene. To maintain the illusion of calm, some studios used head braces, yes, actual metal clamps, hidden behind the subject's hair or collar to keep heads perfectly straight. Children had it worse. tied to backboards bribed with boiled sweets and occasionally retouched into clarity with hand-drawn pupils if their eyes closed at the wrong moment. Speaking of retouching, Victorian photo editing was no light affair. Mistakes were corrected by physically scraping the negative with needles or painting over prints with ink. Want brighter eyes, a more elegant nose, less of that regrettable double chin, all possible for a fee. One studio even offered posthumous edits removing deceased relatives from group photos for reprinting or more grimly adding them in. Some couples skipped pose shots altogether, preferring to photograph the cake, the carriage, or the bouquet. These images now haunt archives like lonely props of forgotten love stories. Others posed in domestic scenes, reading together, pouring tea, or sitting yards apart as though contractually obliged. Wedding attire didn't help. Heavy gowns, high collars, and starched veils made sitting still harder. Sweat glistened under waxy makeup. Gloves left smudges on chair arms. Grooms clutched their top hats like flotation devices. And yet, despite the awkwardness, there was reverence. The photo was proof. Proof it happened, that vows were said, that flowers were arranged, that a moment, however blurry, existed. Guests might forget your vows. Aunt Mildred might confuse the groom's name. But the photograph would endure sepia-toned, slightly out of focus, and full of quiet discomfort. Historians still debate the emotional tone of these photos. Were they cold because love was formalized, or simply a technical necessity of early cameras? Some argue the stiffness reflects the period's restraint. Others believe it hides tenderness behind protocol. Your photographer finally says, "There." You exhale. Your left foot's asleep. Your bouquet is shedding pollen like powdered sugar. But it's done. Immortalized. And in 20 years, when someone finds this framed photo in a trunk, they'll whisper, "They look serious." And maybe that's love in 1873. Serious, scratchy, and slightly blurred at the edges. The reception has begun, but something is missing. There's champagne, certainly. Finger sandwiches and delicate triangles. A string quartet murmurs from a distant corner, like someone trying not to be overheard. Guests murmur, nibble, glide between candlelit corners, and yet not a single soul is dancing. In many Victorian weddings, dancing was quietly discouraged or outright banned, depending on denomination and family temperament. A waltz, even a sedate one, could scandalize Aunt Beatrice. Some saw it as frivolous, others a moral risk. A spinning couple was one misstep away from impropriety, or at least an unsightly glimpse of ankle. Instead, receptions often offered respectful mingling, a phrase which in practice meant awkward hovering near the refreshment table, repeated inquiries about the weather, and a great deal of delicate sipping. Occasionally, a brave soul might initiate a group toast which would erupt into competitive storytelling disguised as compliments. To the bride's beauty, to the groom's industriousness, to the couple's future. May it be less dramatic than the engagement, laughter was permitted but only in measured doses. Anything louder than a chuckle risked seeming undignified. Some families hired musicians to play only background music, tuneful but undanceable. A slow march here, a melancholic sonata there. It was music meant for gentle swaying and polite foot-tapping under the tablecloth. But not all receptions were so restrained. In certain circles, particularly among wealthier urbanites or those with more liberal clergy, dancing crept in soft shoes on polished floors, eyes darting toward chaperones. A discreet quadrille, a scandalous polka, even a reel if the guest list included Scottish cousins. These moments, however, often ended abruptly when an elder cleared their throat with intent. Some receptions replaced dancing with performances. A niece might recite a poem. A cousin might play something on the pianoforte. At one particularly memorable wedding, a groom's brother read a sermon excerpt to remind the couple of the gravity of their union. 3 guests fell asleep, and yet despite the limitations, the reception had its pleasures. Little sandwiches with cress and egg, wine diluted with water so no one would embarrass themselves, confections shaped like swans. A bride once noted in her diary, "I was not permitted to dance, nor to eat much, nor to sit, but the sugared violets were very fine." Historians continue to argue whether these restrained celebrations reflected a deep reverence for marriage or simply a fear of losing control. Some suggest they were meant to prolong the ceremonial dignity of the day. Others believe they were just terribly dull, but no one dared say so. You find yourself near the fireplace sipping something fizzy, watching guests float past like ghosts in gloves. Somewhere, a girl in lilac gloves is practicing dance steps behind a curtain. A boy drops a spoon and blushes. The groom is laughing softly with a great uncle about a mispronounced toast. And still, the music plays melodic, careful, utterly motionless. Like the memory of a dance someone forgot to allow. The dining room is magnificent, gleaming silver porcelain dishes stacked like miniature altars, and platters groaning with delicacies both recognizable and not. There's pheasant aspic jellied eels and at least 3 types of pudding. But the bride. She eats nothing. It's not that she isn't hungry, it's that she isn't supposed to be. Victorian etiquette held strict rules for bridal behavior, and gluttony, or even visible appetite, was considered terribly unfeminine. A proper bride, they said, nibbled. She did not chew. She certainly did not devour. You sit at the head of the table corset, unyielding veil slightly askew, and smile at each course as it's presented. You lift a fork. You pretend to taste. But each bite is a negotiation with your own rib cage. There is no room to digest when your waist has been reduced by 3 inches, and your spine feels like it's been pressed into a decorative molding. Across from you, an uncle digs into his pheasant with primitive enthusiasm. You envy him just slightly. But then remember, you've been instructed to dab, not wipe your lips, and only with the corner of your napkin. You're not even sure which spoon goes with the syllabub, and there are 3. Meals were central to Victorian wedding receptions. Entire menus were printed on hand-painted cards written in French to impress even those who could not translate them. Guests expected grandeur multi-course extravaganzas with oysters, turtle soup, and elaborate centerpieces that occasionally caught fire from too many candles. But the bride's role was ornamental. She was not expected to eat, only to smile appreciatively and answer questions in soft tones. Are you excited? Was the dress uncomfortable? Isn't this aspic divine? All while secretly hoping her veil would hide any signs of indigestion or exhaustion. Some brides ate nothing at all, not from modesty, but from fear. Fainting was not uncommon. Neither was vomiting, though that was never written about in polite circles. The combination of nerves compression and lukewarm consommé proved volatile. One bride's diary mentioned slipping a boiled potato into her sleeve just to have something starchy for later. Another described hiding a marzipan rose in her bouquet. Curiously, no one seemed to notice the bride's plate remained untouched. Too many toasts, too many speeches, too many guests pretending they knew which side of the salmon had the capers. And so, an entire meal unfolded around her, a lavish ghost banquet where the central figure dined on air. Historians remain puzzled by this peculiar tradition. Was it an act of quiet endurance, a social performance of purity and self-denial, or just another moment in a day when the bride was expected to be everywhere and nowhere at once? You shift in your chair, trying not to wince. A fork clinks. The pianist strikes a gentle waltz purely instrumental. You raise your glass, smile again, and quietly tuck a sugared almond into your glove for later for survival, or simply for the small rebellion of taste. The candles are dimmed now. Guests have gone home, the musicians have packed up, and the cake sits uneaten on a lace-draped sideboard. The house is quiet, eerily so. And somewhere upstairs in a room freshly filled with lavender and linens, the newlyweds are about to experience the great Victorian mystery, the wedding night. You climb the stairs like you're entering a courtroom, not out of fear, but because no one has prepared you for what comes next. No instructions, no whispered tips, just 100 assumptions and a corset that still hasn't been fully unlaced. The hallway smells of wax and roses. The door creaks open. Victorian wedding nights were cloaked in silence. Not because they were sacred, but because they were awkward and everyone pretended they weren't happening. Etiquette books said nothing. Mothers rarely offered advice unless it was a vague, be good, dear. Fathers disappeared entirely, and the couple, often strangers in all but name. Some newlyweds sat side by side in silence, sipping tea and admiring the wallpaper. Others, too shy to speak, wrote notes to one another in the shared diary. A few had separate rooms altogether. Whether out of modesty, nerves, or strategic planning is unclear. The wedding night was treated with a paradoxical blend of romantic idealism and social denial. Love poems hinted at intimacy. Portraits showed entwined hands. But actual conversation about what was to happen or not happen was taboo. One diary from 1859 records, "We retired early. It was quiet." Henry read aloud. I dozed. No further comment. There were, of course, exceptions. Some couples had been properly prepared by governesses' medical pamphlets or older siblings with questionable tact. Others had none of this and were left to navigate the experience through trial, error, and guesswork. A few, according to family letters, simply fell asleep in full dress from exhaustion and emotional fatigue. The bed itself was a stage of uncertainty. High, canopied, perfumed, sheets stiff with starch, pillows embroidered. And in the middle, a space that felt both intimate and monumental. Was one supposed to wait, undress, speak? One bride reportedly changed into her nightgown in the closet only to find her new husband snoring when she emerged. Historians continue to debate whether Victorian wedding nights were tender beginnings or quiet disappointments. Some letters suggest genuine affection, others read like performance reviews. One groom wrote to a friend, "The ceremony went well. The evening was an education." There were practical challenges, too. Hair took an hour to unpin. Corsets required help to remove. Stockings had to be rolled down carefully to avoid tearing. For many, the effort of undressing was so immense that actual intimacy was postponed until the next day or week. You sit at the edge of the bed, listening to the soft creak of wood and the ticking of the mantel clock. Your hands are folded, your shoes finally off. Outside, an owl hoots. Inside, everything is still. You exhale. And for a brief moment, there is peace in not knowing what comes next. The vows were spoken, the cake served, the photos barely survived. But for the Victorian bride, the wedding wasn't truly over until every guest, every distant aunt business associate, godparent, and second cousin's wife received a handwritten thank you note. All of them, in proper ink, with perfect etiquette, and ideally without ink stains. You're at your writing desk now, newly installed in a house that doesn't feel quite yours. The room smells of new varnish and unfamiliar routines. A stack of embossed stationery leers at you from across the table. You dip your pensi and begin with the same line. For the 27th time, Mr. and Mrs. Blythe wish to extend their sincerest gratitude for. Victorian thank you notes weren't optional. They were social armor. A prompt, well-written card confirmed your good breeding. A delayed one sparked gossip. Entire families fell out over a misaddressed envelope. Some households kept ledgers, yes, ledgers to track who had been thanked and when. A missed name could doom you to Christmas card exile for decades. Writing these notes was a marathon. Brides were expected to handle the bulk of them, often without help, even as they adjusted to new domestic roles, new wardrobes, and in some cases, new cities. The process could stretch over weeks, even months. One bride reportedly wrote 113 notes before developing a blister that required a poultice. Another dictated hers while lying on a fainting couch. Etiquette manuals offered sample phrases to avoid offense. We are truly grateful for the fine crystal. The thoughtfulness of your gift will remain with us. Your presence at our ceremony brought us joy. Never. We already had 3 of these. Or, what exactly is this object? Though those reactions certainly occurred, some thank you notes were diplomatic masterpieces, especially when gifts were eccentric, a live duck, a copy of Paradise Lost bound in calfskin, a decorative spoon with someone else's initials. One bride responded with, "Your gift was both surprising and memorable. We shall cherish it. No one ever asked what it was." Errors were unforgivable. Smudged ink, incorrect titles, or misspelled names meant rewriting the entire note. Addressing Mrs. Emily Jane Worthing as Ms. E.J. Worthen was not a slip, it was a social crime. Some brides practiced their handwriting daily, wearing gloves to reduce the chance of smudging. Others wrote with a cloth underhand to catch stray ink. There is still debate among historians about the emotional toll of this task. Some see it as a bonding ritual, reflecting on the day honoring connections. Others argue it was the final burden in a gauntlet of bridal labor, one that served social optics more than heartfelt gratitude. Still you write, and write. Your pen scratches softly. The lamplight flickers. Your hand aches. But with each note, you reclaim a little power. You choose the words. You shape the memory. You decide how the day will be remembered. Even if you can't feel your wrist anymore and have now misspelled sincere 3 times in a row. The ceremony faded. The cake hardened. The bouquet dried into a delicate husk atop the mantel. But the marriage that remained. And for some Victorian women, it remained far longer and far more painfully than anyone cared to admit. Because in that era, divorce wasn't just difficult, it was worse than death. You sit in the parlor now, looking out at a garden you didn't plant, in a house filled with gifts from people you no longer hear from. The teacup in your hand rattles slightly nerves, or perhaps just poor glazing. Somewhere in London, a woman you once met is appearing in court, asking not for money, but for release. In Victorian England, divorce required spectacle, a public trial, a moral failing, a shame large enough to justify legal separation. And it had to be proven with witnesses, letters, servants called to testify, and every private misery aired under the soft cough of barristers. For women, the requirements were brutal. A husband could divorce a wife for adultery alone, but a wife. She had to prove not just infidelity, but cruelty, desertion, incest, or unnatural acts phrases that concealed more than they revealed. One judge allegedly said, "A bruised arm may be a loving gesture if it does not produce scars." Another ruled that a wife who fled her husband's household had acted hysterically, thus invalidating her plea. Papers reported on these trials with ghoulish fascination. Wife found with grocer's assistant blared one headline. Earl's daughter, flea's bedroom tyrant claimed another. Women who sued for divorce often became social pariahs, excluded from tea circles, denied invitations, and whispered about in charity meetings. Their children were sometimes taken, their finances frozen. And yet a few persisted. Brave, exhausted, fiercely articulate women who wrote letters to editors, pleaded with Parliament, and insisted that survival was not shameful. They kept journals, some lost, some rediscovered, that offer glimpses of their quiet defiance. One entry reads, "I did not leave for pleasure, I left for breath." There is no scholarly consensus on whether Victorian marriage was broadly repressive or simply uneven. Some argue that for many, companionship was genuine and love possible. Others point to court records, personal diaries, and reform campaigns as evidence that the institution functioned more like a gilded cage adorned with silver but locked nonetheless. And still, divorce remained rare. Most women endured, they adapted, they buried grievances in embroidery and piano music. Some found joy in small freedoms, gardening, letter writing, solitary walks. Others faded quietly, their names preserved only on gravestones beside husbands who outlived or out-argued them. You place the cup back on its saucer. Outside the garden hums with summer insects. A neighbor waves from across the hedge. You wave back polite and wonder not for the first time what would happen if you simply left. Walked away. No suitcase, no note, but you remain, like so many before you, out of duty, out of habit, or simply because in this time staying felt like the only path forward. And yet, as you remain rooted in routine, others arrive unbidden, unwelcome, and often unwashed. They knock, they enter. They upset the dust patterns of your carefully managed drawing room. Because in Victorian England, hosting was not a respite. It was another quiet battlefield. The carriage pulls up late. There's no grand welcome, no host rushing down the gravel drive. Just a stiff butler, a glum-looking footman, and maybe a lantern bobbing in the damp fog. You've arrived at last. After hours of muddy roads, buckle wheels, or unreliable trains, your joints ache. Your gloves are ruined, and your soul is somewhat wrinkled. But none of that matters, because the moment you step onto the stone steps, you are not a traveler. You are a guest, and that role comes with rules. You're expected to smile. You're expected to be gracious. Never mind the fact that you're dizzy from the carriage ride or half frozen from a window that wouldn't shut. A proper Victorian guest arrives looking well-rested, speaking pleasantly, and offering the kind of gentle jokes that do not require too much laughing. Even the act of asking for a chair heaven, forbid must be done, as if you're not desperate for one. And what if you're late? That's a whole separate ordeal. Some households ran on dinner bells so precise you could set a watch by them. Missing your arrival slot wasn't just rude, it was a sign of moral laxity. There are documented cases of guests being scolded for being too enthusiastic when apologizing, as if their guilt made the host look unimportant. The ideal guest, it seems, must be humble, but unbothered, contrite, but not too contrite. Some historians argue that these elaborate expectations were just a way of weeding out the wrong kind of company. If you couldn't survive the journey with your wits and waistcoat intact, perhaps you weren't cut out for the drawing room anyway. Others believe this was more about subtle power, the host displaying control, the guest being gently disarmed. Whatever the theory, one thing is certain: arriving was not about arrival. It was a performance, and the curtains had already risen. There's a pause after you step inside, but it's not the warm silence of welcome. It's the kind of quiet that feels measured, like someone's taken a decibel reading of your footsteps. A butler leads you down a dim corridor. The walls are lined with portraits, half of them look disappointed already. And then you realize your host isn't even here. Victorian formality didn't begin with handshakes and hugs. In fact, the less emotion, the better. Upon arrival, many guests were received not by their host or hostess, but by staff. The butler might offer a nod. The footman might take your bag with the gravity of a pallbearer. And that was it. No cheerful greetings. No come in from the cold, just ritual precision and silence. Why such frost? Because warmth was considered risky. Being too familiar was gauche. A loud hello might mark you as untrained in the social ballet of upper-class England. Hosts, if present, would emerge only after guests had been properly subdued by etiquette. You were expected to wait to be announced, like a character in a play, and to respond with the same restraint. The unspoken rule. Emotions are for amateurs. It's worth noting that some households had their own variations. A host might appear at the top of the stairs, glance down, and disappear. Or a hostess might float in mid-conversation, offer a ghost of a smile, and turn away, leaving you unsure whether to feel honored or dismissed. Some guests wrote in journals about the chilling poetry of being welcomed without being seen. And yet, the silence served a purpose. Historians disagree on what that purpose was. Some argue it preserved dignity, allowing both host and guest to maintain a graceful emotional distance. Others believe it was just a mechanism to avoid awkwardness. After all, no one quite knew how to greet someone who had just bounced down 80 miles of rutted road. In certain country houses, it became a kind of performance art. You were expected to float and silently glance once at a painting, never the butler, and allow yourself to be shown to your room as if you were above all human needs. The idea was to blend in to become part of the house's rhythms, not disrupt them. Even your voice was supposed to match the furnishings, tasteful, restrained, and preferably in pastel. Some guests, especially from less rigid social circles, found this all quietly unbearable. Letters survive describing the death-like hush of a particular drawing room or the terror of sneezing at the wrong moment. One visitor to a Yorkshire manor recounted how his friend was not invited back after daring to cough audibly in the vestibule. Still, silence wasn't always cold. Sometimes it was strategic. A way to offer space to delay expectations to remind everyone that socializing in this house was not a free-for-all. It was choreography. And you lucky guest had just stepped into the dance. The spare bedroom, what a polite phrase for what was often a half-frozen holding cell. You followed the footman up a creaking staircase past the warm fire-lit rooms, meant for family or higher-ranking guests, and finally stop at a door that groans as it opens. Inside a narrow bed, 2 threadbare blankets and a single candlestick, doing its best not to flicker out. This is where you'll sleep. Maybe. The guest room in many Victorian homes was less an oasis and more a leftover, usually the least desirable chamber in the house. It might be on the top floor where wind slid through window frames like a thief, or tucked beside the servant stairs with constant creaks and clangs keeping you company. And forget about central heating, it didn't exist. At best, you'd get a brick heated in the kitchen hearth and wrapped in flannel, placed carefully at the foot of your bed. Wool blankets were thin and pillows. Well, let's just say no one was worried about neck support. Some pillows were filled with feathers that poke through the ticking fabric. Others were inexplicably lumpy, as if they had absorbed too many secrets from previous guests. The mattress might sag like a hammock, or feel like sleeping on an oatcake. But no matter the discomfort, you'd better not complain. To do so would be to admit weakness, and nobody wanted to be the difficult guest. There were unspoken codes here, too. You were expected to unpack, swiftly arrange your hairbrush and toiletries in silent symmetry, and perhaps sit politely on the edge of the bed, as if rehearsing how to look grateful. One letter from the time describes a lady who fainted from cold, but insisted it was just nerves lest she embarrass her host. That tells you all you need to know. And it wasn't just the cold. The decor often carried its own menacing charm. Faded wallpaper with roses that seemed to droop in judgment. Family portraits where ancestors stared at you like you'd already failed them. Or taxidermy birds always positioned just so watchful, disapproving. It was a room where comfort came second to social optics. There's ongoing debate among historians about the true purpose of these spare rooms. Some argue they were designed to humble guests, subtly reminding them of their outsider status. Others suggest it was simply a matter of tradition, that these rooms had always been spare, and formality overruled updates. Still, others note that the cold wasn't considered cruel. It was just how things were. And your endurance was part of your charm. Whatever the rationale, one thing remains clear: sleep was not guaranteed. You might lie awake for hours, teeth chattering, listening to the wind whistle through cracks in the wall. You might dream of fireplaces you weren't allowed to light, or imagine the footsteps outside your door were friendly. They weren't. That was just the maid bringing up the shared bathwater, and that's a whole new ordeal. The knock is soft, but insistent. A chambermaid stands outside your door, holding a tin pail that steams faintly in the cold air. You're not first in line for the bath, not by a long shot. She nods once and sets the water down. You're meant to be grateful. The water, lukewarm and faintly soapy, has already hosted 3 other bodies. Victorian bathing customs could be described as democratic, if by democratic one means that hierarchy determined who got clean and who marinated in the leftovers. In many homes, the host bathed first, followed by the spouse, then the children in descending age. Finally, the guests took their turn, not just in separate water, mind. You the same tub, the same water growing cloudier and more fragrant with each participant. Cleanliness was measured less by actual hygiene and more by appearances. One smell might be tolerated if wrapped in lavender sachets and a tightly buttoned bodice. But one's demeanor, that had to be pristine. Complaining about the water was worse than showing up unwashed. Some guests brought their own tin basins or sponged off at night using vinegar and a cloth, a method both disinfecting and disheartening. The bathtub itself was often in a chilly side room or wheeled in and out on demand. Porcelain if you were lucky. More often it was a large metal tub that clanged ominously with every shift. The water cooled quickly, and because fuel was precious, refilling was rare. If you hesitated too long, the bath went from uncomfortable to practically punitive. What's fascinating is how little this seemed to bother people, at least outwardly. Guests wrote glowing thank you notes while quietly dabbing at rashes. Hosts boasted of their hospitality even as they doled out bath slots like ration cards. Historians remain divided. Was this about economy decorum, or simply a blind spot in Victorian values? Perhaps all 3. Or perhaps, as one scholar wryly noted, a stiff upper lip survives best when submerged in reused water. And it wasn't just the water, it was the ritual. One guest recalled being offered a modesty screen so narrow that it covered neither dignity nor drafts. Another described trying to bathe while 2 housemaids refilled the kettle nearby, their expressions unreadable but clearly amused. There was no privacy, no illusion of luxury, only the ceremony of being seen doing things properly, no matter how improper they felt. A few progressive homes experimented with personal baths or even indoor plumbing, but these were rare and usually met with suspicion. Too modern, some sniffed. Too American, said others, as if cleanliness itself might betray one's lineage. And so you crouch in tepid water, hoping the scum near your knee belonged to someone aristocratic. You scrub as gently as possible with a sliver of soap, mindful not to splash. You listen to footsteps echo down the hall, knowing someone else is waiting, probably hungrier, colder, and next in line for the bath. And breakfast. That's coming soon. You'll need to be dressed and ready for it, preferably by dawn. The sky outside is still ink dark. A single candle flickers on the washstand. Somewhere in the distance, a gong will soon sound, not for alarm, but for tea. It's 5:00 a.m., and you have exactly 2 hours to transform yourself from half-frozen mortal into a presentable Victorian silhouette. Time to wrestle with your corset, your cravat, and the knowledge that no one will even serve eggs until you look like someone who deserves them. Victorian mornings were not for sleeping. They were for proving. Guests were expected to appear fully dressed and socially alert by 7:00 a.m. tea. Not breakfast, mind you, tea. A light affair typically served in a parlor with creaky chairs, a modest tray of toast, and a host who might or might not glance up from the newspaper. You meanwhile must be poised fresh-faced and ready to engage in polite morning chatter, as if you hadn't just spent the last hour in a silent wrestling match with 10 layers of fabric and a bone-stiffened bodice. The ideal guest didn't shuffle in, bleary-eyed with pillow lines on their cheek. They glided gracefully without yawning and responded to, "Did you sleep well?" with a courteous lie. Sleep was seen as a private indulgence, being caught craving it nearly shameful. One popular etiquette guide of the time warned against guests who emerged from bed as if from the grave. It recommended a short walk before tea to refresh the color, never mind that the only thing open at that hour was frost. This requirement for early dressing led to a quiet panic behind closed doors. Guests often rose before dawn to start the process, especially women who needed time for hair arrangement, lacing, pinning, and the delicate application of cold cream to dull the effects of a frigid night's sleep. One memoir recalls a guest's maid waking her at 4:30 a.m. with a brisk "Madam, the house expects." She replied, "It may expect, but I do not perform." She was not invited again. Interestingly, some scholars suggest that this early ritual had more to do with signaling social discipline than any real need for tea. It demonstrated one's mastery over the body, the clock, and one's emotions, all three of which were prone to rebellion. Others argue it was simply about appearances, a way to create the illusion of energy and control, even when both were running perilously low. Still, not everyone complied. Letters reveal guests who feigned illness to avoid early gatherings, or who invented phantom ailments to explain their bleary eyes. A few bold souls even asked for breakfast trays to be brought upstairs, though this was seen as a breach of etiquette unless one was visibly dying. So you rise stiffly. You dress in silence, avoiding the cracked mirror's judgment. You tie your shoes by candlelight and practice a polite smile that says nothing about your actual state of mind. And as you descend to the drawing room, the house breathes around you, disciplined, proper, and slightly chilled. The tea is lukewarm, the toast is dry, and you've never been more performatively awake. The tea is barely settled in your stomach when the first volley of conversation arrives. It's not light chatter, no remarks on the weather, no lazy compliments on the toast. A gentleman remarks on a parliamentary speech. A lady counters with an anecdote about Greek sculpture. You smile, nod, and quickly scan your internal index of things you vaguely remember from finishing school. Because from this moment on, silence is not restful, it's suspicious. In Victorian households, being a guest meant being relentlessly interesting. Morning to evening, you were expected to converse with Polish depth and ideally wit. Small talk was seen as an amateur's crutch. Instead, intellectual sparring was the norm, and if you happened to be more of a listener, tough luck. The drawing room did not reward spectators. Hosts often curated their guest lists like casting directors. A charming poet, a slightly jaded military man, a woman with an encyclopedic memory of Latin phrases. You were there to perform a role, preferably one that involved never pausing for more than 5 seconds without contributing something erudite. One famously picky hostess kept a mental tally of how often each guest said, The man who led the count was not invited back. And it wasn't just the topics, it was how you handled them. You needed to know enough to discuss foreign policy, but not so much that you appeared to be lecturing. Humor was welcome, but must be drier than the toast. Sarcasm was acceptable only if it floated like a feather, not landed like a brick. One guest reportedly got the entire drawing room to go silent by making a joke about Darwin's beard. Apparently too specific. What's worse, napping was frowned upon. You were expected to maintain conversational energy until the late hours, even if your body begged for rest. One exhausted guest wrote in his journal, "I tried to feign interest in the silk trade of Persia, but my eyelids betrayed me." Another admitted to pinching himself under the table during a 3-hour discussion of Roman aqueducts. Scholars remain divided on whether this verbal marathon served as genuine intellectual stimulation or was simply a subtle form of torture. Some suggest it mirrored the broader Victorian obsession with self-control and mental superiority. Others argue it created a culture where performance mattered more than sincerity, where even kindness had to be expressed with the correct vocabulary. And yet, there was a strange rhythm to it all. Guests learned to ride the waves of dialogue, to toss in a clever turn of phrase, to feign interest in the finer points of Venetian glassmaking. Occasionally, you found yourself enjoying it, if only because your alternative was being labeled low-spirited, a term far more damning than it sounds. So, you sit straighter. You sip your third cup of tea. You nod as someone misquotes Cicero, and you mentally rehearse your next line. Something about the influence of Norse mythology on mid-century poetry, perhaps. Yes, that'll do. Just don't say, Later that evening, when your brain is a gently scrambled pudding of trivia and strained politeness, you finally retreat to your room. Not to rest. Oh no. Rest implies peace. What you face instead is a door that doesn't lock a corridor, that never truly quiets, and a growing awareness that privacy here is more aspiration than reality. Victorian guest rooms, like most of the era's architecture, were designed with an emphasis on structure, not sanctuary. Doors rarely had interior locks. In many homes, they didn't even latch properly. Staff would come and go as needed, whether to stoke a fire, deliver bath water, or fetch forgotten slippers. The idea of knocking was optional. Often it was skipped entirely in favor of a brisk, efficient entrance, as if the room itself still belonged to the house, and you were merely borrowing its warmth. You might try placing a chair against the handle, a subtle signal of your desire for solitude. But even that could be misread. In one account, a guest who blocked his door with furniture was later accused of having theatrical tendencies. Another was found reading in bed and gently scolded by the butler for overexertion of the mind. Privacy was not just scarce, it was seen as a kind of rebellion, and the architecture didn't help. Thin walls let every cough and creak travel like gossip. Shared corridors meant you heard boots at midnight, whispers at dawn, and the ever-reliable shriek of hinges that had never been oiled. Even your letters weren't safe. In some homes, the maid would collect outgoing mail, and the hostess might read it first for appropriateness. Some guests even brought decoy letters just in case. Historians suggest that this lack of privacy wasn't accidental. It reinforced the host's control over the domestic realm, turning the guest's experience into a curated performance. You weren't just visiting, you were being observed, measured, and gently corrected. There's debate over whether this was oppressive or simply normal for the time. Some scholars argue that personal space as we understand it today simply wasn't a concept then. People lived more communally with blurred boundaries between public and private. Others point out that the elite had their own rooms, with locks implying the guest's vulnerability was part of the design. Even mundane tasks felt exposed. Want to change clothes? Best do it behind a folding screen, or time it when the hallway sounds quiet. Need a moment to weep into a handkerchief after being told your joke about Venetian opera was a bit too continentally forward. Best save it for the nighttime, under the covers, silently. And yet, guests kept coming. They kept playing along. They endured the unlocked doors, the silent entries, the sense of being watched while trying to sleep. Because in the Victorian house to demand solitude was to seem suspicious. Better to endure it with a smile, and maybe a well-placed decoy letter, just in case tomorrow's gossip features you. A deep clang reverberates through the house, solemn measured, unmistakable. It's the dinner bell, and whatever you were doing must now stop. Not in 5 minutes, not after one last page of your book, now. Because missing a Victorian dinner was not simply rude, it was social suicide served cold on a silver platter. Dinner in a well-run household was choreographed to the minute. A gong or bell, some the size of shipboys, would echo down every corridor. Guests had just enough time to adjust a cufflink, repin a brooch, and descend the staircase in an orderly, stylish procession. Lateness wasn't just noted, it was remembered. Some guests even set pocket watches by the household schedule to avoid disaster. One anecdote tells of a gentleman who tripped down the stairs rather than risk arriving at the dining room door 2 minutes late. His sprained ankle was considered more polite than his tardiness would have been. The reasoning behind this punctuality obsession is layered. On the surface, it was about courtesy respecting the host, the cook, and the carefully timed roast. But deeper down, it reinforced hierarchy. The host set the rhythm of the evening, and guests were expected to fall in line, literally and figuratively. A delay in dinner meant a crack in the household's smooth veneer, and that was unthinkable. Scholars have noted that many elite homes in this period functioned more like mini courts than residences. The dinner bell was your summons, and you were expected to obey. Once seated assigned places naturally, the dinner commenced in a sequence nearly as rigid. Soup, fish, meat, sweets. The number of courses varied, but the etiquette remained unwavering. Conversation had to flow, but not overshadow the meal. You could speak to the person beside you, but not across the table. You could compliment the soup, but not the cutlery. And whatever you did, you must not refuse a dish too emphatically, as it might imply critique of the host's choices. The pressure to perform even while eating was intense. Guests rehearsed polite laughter between bites and practiced holding cutlery at exactly the right angle. Some brought mental notes of safe topics to deploy between the fish and the fowl, and heaven forbid you sneeze, drop a spoon, or knock over a wine glass. Such errors were whispered about long after dessert was served. Historians debate whether these rituals fostered civility or induced a quiet dread. Some suggest it was about imposing structure in an otherwise chaotic world. Others argue it was theater, an opportunity to demonstrate grace under pressure. Either way, dinner wasn't just nourishment. It was a proving ground. And so, you sit back straight, napkin folded, just so nodding at a joke you barely hear, because you're focused on not impaling a carrot at the wrong angle. The roast arrives, you smile, you chew. You agree that the sauce is delightfully restrained. And all the while, you know, if you had been even 60 seconds late, none of this performance would matter. You'd already have failed the first test. You've survived the soup course, the game bird, and the blancmange. The hostess dabs her lips and suggests a change of topic, discreet code for the conversational waltz to begin. But beware, this is no free-form dance. In a Victorian dining room, even words had a dress code. And if your small talk wore the wrong shoes, you might never get invited back. Acceptable conversation topics were curated with the same care as the silverware. Art, literature, music, foreign travel. These were welcome. Money, health, religion, or weather, utterly taboo. Oddly enough, a heated discussion on Byzantine tile work was fine, but mention your toothache or the price of coal and you'd cause a silence thick enough to carve. Guests were expected to be interesting, without being personal, insightful, without being too opinionated, and above all, never ever boring in the wrong direction. Some households took this control a step further by issuing actual topic cards. These miniature guides listed safe themes to discuss before and after dinner. One example still preserved in a country estate archive includes suggested phrases like, "Has anyone read the latest translation of Virgil, and what are your thoughts on the moral tone of mid-century opera?" One wonders how many guests truly had strong feelings about either, but the question wasn't sincerity, it was form. This verbal dressage baffled newcomers. One visitor from America described it as like fencing with invisible rules, where every thrust might offend someone you hadn't even seen yet. And indeed, it often felt that way. You might innocently praise the weather in Paris, only to find out that the lady across the table lost a cousin there in a flood, or mention a fondness for country walks, not realizing the gentleman beside you owned half the moor and resented trespassers. What makes the whole affair more intricate is the overlay of unspoken rivalries. Conversation was rarely just about exchange, it was performance. Some guests came prepared with memorized quotes or obscure facts, ready to deploy them like grenades of elegance. Others rehearsed anecdotes in advance, testing their delivery on maids and mirrors. There was a social prize for being delightful, but even higher stakes for avoiding being labeled provincial. Historians note that this conversational tightrope reflected broader societal anxieties. The upper classes feared disruption, emotional, financial, or ideological. By fencing off certain topics, they created a controlled environment where appearances remained polished and messy realities stayed outside. Some argue this habit fostered a kind of brittle harmony. Others call it emotional claustrophobia in a lace doily. Still, every once in a while, someone slipped. A guest might blurt out a political opinion or accidentally compliment a rival's inferior wine. The reaction was never direct, just a sudden chill, a dropped eyelash, a slightly too polite smile. And then, perhaps weeks later, a quiet removal from future invitations. So, tonight you nod along as someone compares Gothic cathedrals to moral instruction. You offer a quip about tapestry. You carefully avoid referencing anything you actually care about. And when the hostess smiles at you across the table, you wonder, was that approval? Or warning, the plates are cleared. The port is passed. A brief sigh of relief settles in the room, but not for long, because now it's time for what hosts coyly called evening amusements. And for guests, it was anything but optional. Like soldiers summoned to drill you rise, when summoned ready to play charades, read poetry aloud, or accompany a tone-deaf cousin on the pianoforte. Joy. After dinner, Victorian guests were expected to participate in structured activities designed to showcase refinement, wit, or musical talent, sometimes all three. This wasn't just light entertainment, it was another arena for social judgment. A guest who declined to play the card game or hesitated too long when asked to recite a sonnet risked being labeled low-spirited dull, or worst of all, melancholic. In a world where emotional restraint was sacred, admitting fatigue or disinterest felt like whispering sedition. The games themselves varied by household. Some favored intellectual diversions, reading aloud from popular serialized novels, reciting Shakespeare, or staging impromptu tableaux vivants. Frozen scenes acted out in costume, often with no warning and dubious lighting. Others leaned toward parlor games like Consequences Musical Chairs or The Minister's Cat. And if you think those sound harmless, imagine playing them with one eye on your reputation and the other on the hostess's furrowed brow. One guest wrote, "I pretended to faint during a game of forfeits, just to avoid kissing the hand of Sir Lionel. It did not go unnoticed." Another confided in a letter home, "The piano sounded like a chicken drowning, and yet I was expected to smile and clap." Historians disagree on whether these amusements were intended to build community or simply to maintain control. Some argue they offered rare opportunities for women to display skill, musical or literary, in a world that otherwise demanded quiet decorum. Others suggest it was just structured exhaustion, another way to keep guests too busy to reflect or worse, rebel. What's undeniable is that refusal was not considered a real choice. A polite decline might be tolerated once, especially if couched in a headache. But habitual disengagement earned subtle retribution. You'd find yourself seated at the end of the table, excluded from walks, or, as one diary entry dryly noted, remembered less fondly in the guest book. And yet, there were occasional moments of genuine delight. A rousing piano duet, a hilarious misreading of a poem, a spontaneous skit that actually made people laugh. For a brief hour, the drawing room could feel almost warm, almost human. But those moments were fleeting, and usually accompanied by the silent awareness that even laughter was being assessed. So, you rise from your chair and take your place near the hearth. You fan a deck of cards with the flair of someone who's read a manual. You read your poem safely inoffensive, rhythmically respectable. You smile. You clap. You cheer for a game you don't understand. And just as you begin to feel the twinge of weariness, you remember the kitchen closed at 8. And no, you may not sneak a biscuit. By the time the last piano chord has wobbled into silence and the final game of charades has ended in polite confusion, your stomach begins to whisper what your manners dare not say it's hungry. But you already know the answer. Because in a proper Victorian house, the kitchens are shut, the larders locked, and any desire for snacks after 8 p.m. is to be smothered along with the candles. Nighttime hunger, it seems, is simply part of your refinement. Late-night eating was considered vulgar. Snacks were the province of children, invalids, and the working class. A true gentleman or lady was expected to master their appetite and trust in the virtue of an early supper. The idea that one might grow peckish after an evening of mental and musical aerobics was rarely acknowledged, let alone accommodated. Some homes offered a single dry biscuit with evening tea, a gesture so subtle it bordered on cruel, and even that tea gone by sundown. The silver was polished, the staff dismissed, and the pantry door closed with a sound that felt very much like judgment. You might peer into your travel bag, hoping you'd packed a secret apple or crumbling oatcake. But even sneaking a bite carried risk. Imagine being discovered with crumbs on your collar. One guest recounted how a friend was caught nibbling candied ginger in his room and was never invited back. The offense, private indulgence. Scholars remain divided on this late evening austerity. Some argue it reflected a deeper cultural belief that discipline, especially of the body, was morally elevating. Others suggest it was a cost-saving measure cleverly disguised as etiquette. And a few more cynical minds believe it was simply a way to ensure guests remained slightly uncomfortable, and thus slightly more grateful. Whatever the reasoning, the effect was, clear hunger became a companion, shadowing the dim halls like a silent maid. You'd lie in bed listening to your stomach argue with your spine, knowing that downstairs sat an untouched wheel of cheese or a forgotten jam tart, sealed behind glass like a museum artifact. A few rebellious guests tried creative solutions. One man stored a biscuit in a hat box. A clever woman wrapped hard candy in her corset lining. But these covert snacks came at great psychological cost. There is no flavor, one guest wrote, so lonely as one eaten in secret. Occasionally, a more relaxed household might offer a late glass of sherry or a corner plate of sliced apples. But these were rare exceptions, usually from hosts with foreign sensibilities or scandalously modern views. Most of the time, nighttime was meant for restraint, for silence, for rumbling, sleep-deprived contemplation, and so you lie there blanketed in wool and regret. You recall the almond cake from dinner, and wonder if anyone noticed how little you ate. You wonder if the mice in the wall are enjoying their midnight feast. You wonder if being civilized is really worth this gnawing. And with that stomach muttering like a discontented butler, you try to sleep. Because tomorrow brings more social gymnastics, and breakfast is still hours away. Morning comes with fresh daylight and a peculiar sound crinkling paper and the clatter of silver spoons and teacups. You shuffle into the breakfast room, bleary-eyed and hopeful for eggs. Instead, what you find is an ambush. A stack of letters sits in the center of the table, freshly opened. Your name is among them, and someone is already reading it aloud. In certain Victorian homes, personal correspondence wasn't personal at all. Letters addressed to guests were often opened by staff and in some cases shared at breakfast as casual entertainment. Not maliciously, at least not overtly. It was framed as part of the household's intellectual culture, a light-hearted start to the day. But the effect, like being caught half-dressed in front of a full-length mirror, and everyone else brought opera glasses. The practice varied from house to house. In some only particularly amusing letters were read those with odd phrasing dramatic handwriting or juicy news about mutual acquaintances. In others, anything sent through the post was fair game. One lady's note about her mother's gout was reportedly read aloud with theatrical flair. Another guest's mundane reminder to pick up a waistcoat was met with snorts and quips. Politeness dictated that you laugh along. Dignity dictated that you never send anything personal by post again. Some guests attempted to preempt the performance by asking for their mail directly. The response was usually a beatific smile and a vague comment about how things are done here. Others tried sealing their letters with elaborate wax crests, hoping the effort would discourage meddling. It rarely worked. A host curious enough to have your missives read aloud was rarely deterred by a griffin seal. Historians continue to puzzle over this ritual. Was it simple nosiness disguised as amusement? A social mechanism to dissolve barriers and create communal intimacy? Or was it something darker, a method of soft surveillance where hosts gently reminded guests that nothing within the estate's walls was truly private? There's no firm consensus, but one thing is clear for guests: this created an atmosphere of quiet paranoia. You found yourself composing letters with an imagined audience, softening every line, excising any complaint. One guest wrote to her cousin, "Even this letter I write with restraint for it may be tomorrow's entertainment served with marmalade." And yet some seemed to enjoy it. Certain guests took pride in being featured reading their own letters with dramatic flair or inserting jokes meant to amuse the room. It became another form of performance, another layer in the endless masquerade of the Victorian visit. So, you stir your porridge and listen as someone reads a cousin's description of your frivolous fondness for pale gloves. You smile, you sip, you pretend it's all in good humor. But later when you sit down to write your reply, you pause. You choose your words like stepping stones across a river. And at the bottom of the page in the smallest possible script you write, "Please don't reply until I've left this house." You've nearly made it. Your suitcase is repacked, your smile fixed in place, and yet you are not allowed to simply leave. In the Victorian social calendar, departure was not an action, it was a ceremony. And it took days. That's right, days. Saying goodbye wasn't a moment at the door. It was a multi-act performance complete with scripts, props, and emotional pirouettes. It began the night before with vague farewells offered over teacups. "We shall miss your conversation terribly," someone might say, with the same tone used for tax season. Then came the parting gifts, small tokens like lavender sachets, inscribed booklets, or jars of jam you would never open but must admire enthusiastically. And finally, the calling cards, dozens of them. One for the host, one for the hostess, one for the cook. If they had acknowledged your compliments on the blancmange, the morning of your departure required precision. You were expected to rise early again and be dressed for travel and formal farewells before breakfast. Your trunk had to be neatly strapped and visible in the entryway as if to prove your organizational virtue. Your appearance must suggest a blend of reluctant departure and serene gratitude. The term bittersweet might come to mind, though mostly for the hosts who could now reclaim the good towels. But you weren't done yet. A formal goodbye often required making the rounds. First the hosts, then any notable guests. Possibly the household pets if they had been elevated to honorary conversationalists. You exchanged gentle pleasantries about the pleasure of your company and how swiftly the days have flown, knowing full well that every syllable was part of the final exam. One guest described it as a theatrical finale with no clear audience. Another compared it to graduating from a school where no one told you the grades. And the worst part, it didn't even end when you left the house. Once you returned home, a thank you note had to be written within 48 hours. Failure to do so risks social exile. These notes were miniature performances in themselves, half poetry, half hostage letter. The tranquility of your estate remains vivid in my heart. You might write editing out the part where you slept with your boots on to keep warm. Some even included sketches or pressed flowers, as if physical beauty could distract from the spiritual exhaustion of the visit. Historians suggest this extended farewell served several purposes. It reinforced bonds, displayed gratitude, and maintained the polite illusion that the visit had been a pleasure for everyone involved. Others argue it was a social control mechanism, a final test of a guest's refinement memory and emotional stamina. Still others believe it was simply inertia. Once a ritual becomes tradition, it gains weight beyond logic. So, you stand in the vestibule, gloved and smiling, nodding at remarks about your refreshing spirit. You board the carriage with a final wave. You ride away wondering how long this will be remembered and whether you passed or merely endured. And in your lap sits the thank you note template already half drafted in your mind. The carriage has rattled out of sight. The estate fades behind you into mist and memory. But you're not quite gone, not yet, because your name now lives inside a book. Leather-bound, spine cracked, kept in a drawer or on a writing desk, the guest book. A silent archive of every visitor, every impression, every tiny social triumph or misstep. You've left footprints in the parlor, yes, but this is where they're officially recorded. The Victorian guest book was more than a novelty. It was a ledger of social worth. Hosts would often invite their guests to sign during their stay, a ritual that sounded simple enough, a signature, a date, perhaps a witty line. But behind that gentle request lay an intricate web of unspoken stakes. A flourish too large might seem vain. A joke too cheeky might raise eyebrows. Some guests practiced their entries in advance, fearing their legacy would be judged by the curvature of their G. But the real danger came later, when the guests were gone and the host or hostess took pen in hand. In the margins or in separate columns, they might jot private notes. Too talkative at table, improper remarks about the archbishop, charming laugh possibly rehearsed. These annotations were rarely shown, but often remembered. In some households, these records help determine who received future invitations. In others, they simply became a quiet litany of social rankings. One guest book discovered in a Suffolk manor revealed coded symbols beside names. A check mark meant acceptable, a star meant delightful, a small dash, never again. Scholars who have studied such ledgers note how they evolved into stealth tools of curation, allowing hosts to maintain a community of the right sort, while gently excluding those who disrupted the delicate balance of conversation, manners, or bedtime sherry. There's debate among historians about whether these books were truly influential or just passive chronicles. Some argue they functioned as emotional scrapbooks capturing a host's impressions the way a diary might. Others believe they were a quiet enforcement mechanism, lending weight and consequence to what might otherwise be fleeting interactions. Either way, for guests, the knowledge of the guest book's existence was enough to induce a special kind of vigilance. Many guests tried to manage their own entries, carefully calibrating charm and humility. One woman reportedly rewrote her entry 3 times before handing it in, citing a sudden attack of modesty. Another young man signed his name alongside a Shakespeare quote, only to find out later that the host despised Shakespeare. His name was followed by a curt note fond of drama on and off paper. And so, even as you ride away finally free, at least in body, You're still present in that drawing room. Tucked between pages of embossed vellum, your name lingers. Maybe you impressed, maybe you annoyed, maybe you were simply noted. As the wheels jolt over the uneven road and the countryside blurs past, you wonder, what did they write next to your name, and will that dash mean you've dined there for the last time? The carriage slows, not because you've arrived anywhere, but because your mind has. Days later, back in your own home, wrapped in mercifully soft blankets, you find yourself reliving every smile, every nod, every slightly too loud laugh. The visit is over, but the analysis just beginning. Because here's the part no one tells you: some Victorian guests never returned. Not because they refused, but because they were quietly uninvited. And the worst part, you'd rarely know why. It could be anything. Perhaps you mispronounced a surname. Maybe your enthusiasm for roast pheasant came off as gluttonous. Or it was your laugh a touch too jarring during a somber toast. One guest was blacklisted after she mentioned she preferred her own linen. Another, after asking perfectly reasonably whether it was acceptable to read novels before luncheon. The Victorian house was a test wrapped in tinsel. You were being evaluated not on charm alone, but on nuance. Did you leave your gloves out overnight? Tsk. Did you speak too little and therefore seem dull, or too much and seem self-important? Was your thank you note written on time using good cream paper? Did you quote Wordsworth instead of Tennyson? These judgments didn't come with explanation or appeal. There was no letter saying thank you for your visit, but your anecdote about steam engines was a touch coarse. No scorecard, just silence. The next invitation never came. A holiday season passed without a card. A shared acquaintance failed to mention that spring picnic, and over time you simply realized you had been edited out. Historians remain intrigued by this quiet excommunication. Some suggest it was a kind of social hygiene hosts pruning their guest lists like overgrown hedges. Others see it as a symptom of deeper anxiety in a world obsessed with order unpredictability, no matter how polite was a threat. And yet most guests accepted their fate without protest. After all, the game had always been rigged. One diarist wrote, "I was not invited back to Grosvenor Hall. I suspect the pomegranate incident." Another merely noted, "Mrs. T has ceased to write. My opinion on boiled milk may be to blame." In a strange way, the silence could be a relief. No more wool blankets in frozen rooms. No more sharing bathwater with baronets. No more pretending to enjoy poetry readings while your stomach pouted from missed meals. Rejection in this context became its own kind of freedom. But still you wonder, did you pass the tests no one explained? Were you judged by your conversation or your compliance? Did your smile hide your hunger well enough? Did you play charades with sufficient grace? Did the guest book bear your name with a check mark or a dash? You fold the thank you note you never sent. Perhaps it's better that way. The carriage rattles on, real or imagined. The manner fades, but its echo lingers a world where hospitality was performance, politeness was pressure, and sleep. Well, sleep was for people who hadn't been invited. The halls are quiet now. The guest book is closed, the biscuits are locked away, and the last candle has guttered into waxy silence. You've stepped out of the Victorian manor, but its chill lingers not in your bones, but in your thoughts. All those rituals, all that watching, performing, adjusting. A world where charm was a currency, silence, a language, and the beds. Always a little too cold. But here in your own time, your own bed, you can breathe. There are no corsets, no letters to draft, no social riddles to decode. Just the soft hum of modern night, a pillow that forgives, and maybe even a snack waiting in the kitchen. You've earned this stillness. If stories like these help you drift into dreams, into quiet, into someplace softer than history, well, you're not alone. Maybe leave a sleepy emoji. And tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. Also, who or what should we explore next?